The office door slammed open with sudden force, making several coworkers jump in their chairs as two compliance officers, dressed in matching company polos, arms loaded with empty cardboard boxes and thick clipboards, strode directly toward my desk like soldiers on a mission, while Thomas Caldwell, my boss, followed right behind with his arms crossed tightly over his chest, chin high, looking smug and triumphant as if he had finally won a long war. He raised his voice loud enough for the entire open floor to hear every word, announcing, "We're conducting a full audit of every single file, email, document, note, and spreadsheet connected in any way to the Peterson contract. This is official and non-negotiable," causing heads to pop up over cubicle walls and whispers to ripple across the room like wind through dry grass. I felt my heart slam once against my ribs, but I forced myself to take one long, slow breath through my nose, keeping my face completely calm and unreadable because I had learned years ago in tense negotiations never to let anyone see fear or surprise. Instead, I looked straight into Thomas's eyes and asked just one quiet, measured question. Did the legal department formally approve this exact scope of the audit? And for the briefest moment, barely a blink, his confident gaze flickered sideways, with uncertainty, a tiny crack appearing in the armor he wore so proudly, while the lead compliance officer actually paused mid-step with his clipboard half raised, clearly thrown off by my simple question. And the whole room seemed to freeze, as if everyone sensed something important had just shifted without anyone saying it out loud. 3 months earlier, Thomas had pushed me hard to fast-track approval on a risky new vendor tied to the Peterson deal. Even though every internal risk flag, red, flashing, screaming, was lit up warning that we should hold off and do more due diligence, I had refused to sign off because the exposure was too great and protocol was crystal clear, but he grew angry, snatched the override form from my hand, scrawled his own signature across it in bold black ink, bypassed every required secondary review, and sent it forward himself while telling me in a low, threatening tone to stop being difficult or there will be consequences. And because I knew better than to argue in the moment, I quietly archived every piece of that interaction, the full email chain with timestamps, the scanned override form bearing his unmistakable signature, the automatic forwards that went straight into the permanent audit trail no one else could easily access or delete without leaving digital footprints, and, most importantly, the one tiny procedural clause buried deep in legal's standard workflow document that almost nobody ever read carefully. A clause stating that any managerial override of a flagged high-risk item required mandatory notification to the board within 48 hours, or the override would be automatically invalid and subject to full retroactive review. I had saved it all in my personal encrypted cloud folder, untouched and pristine, waiting like a loaded spring. Back in the present, the compliance officers began pulling files from my drawers and boxing them up while Thomas hovered nearby pretending to supervise, but really watching my face for any sign of panic. They mirrored my laptop screen to their own devices, so they could copy everything, then escorted me to a small windowless conference room down the hall, where I sat alone at a plain table under harsh fluorescent light, while the lead officer, a tall woman with sharp glasses, fired off prepared. Questions about the Peterson contract approvals, my role in vendor selection, and why certain risk reports appeared incomplete according to the anonymous tip they claimed to have received. But I answered none of those loaded questions and instead politely requested a complete chain of custody log for every document listed in their complaint so I could verify proper handling, which made her raise one eyebrow because most people never knew to ask for that from the hallway through the glass. While I caught Thomas glancing in nervously, shifting his weight from foot to foot, and I realized my total silence was already working better than any defense I could speak, because every unanswered question forced them to reveal more of their hand, while I stayed perfectly still, letting their own momentum carry them closer to the edge. The lead officer leaned toward her colleague and whispered something I barely caught. This investigation just got wider than we planned, and although my stomach tightened with adrenaline, I also felt a quiet surge of certainty, because I already knew exactly why it had to widen. When they finally let me return to my now half-empty office, the scene felt surreal. My framed awards had been removed from the wall and stacked in a box. Loose papers were sorted into neat piles inside cardboard containers. Even my pens had been lined up like little soldiers on the desk, as though someone wanted to show how thorough and controlled they were. I sat down slowly and watched the compliance team move methodically through the space like predators searching for prey, opening drawers, photographing pages, sealing evidence bags, while Thomas lingered just outside my doorframe, peeking over cubicle partitions with sharp, darting eyes, convinced he had me cornered. He had underestimated me for years, treating me like someone who would fold under pressure, and that single miscalculation was his first and biggest mistake, because I began my own silent audit right then, mentally logging every procedural slip they made. The officer who failed to initial a chain of custody form, the one who left a sensitive folder slightly askew on my desk instead of sealing it immediately, every unnecessary comment they muttered to each other. And I knew one particular file, the one containing the override he thought had vanished into the system, was still exactly where it needed to be. Using the temporary mirror laptop they had left me, I carefully logged into my secure personal cloud archive. Everything Thomas had ever touched carried an immutable timestamp and version history, and I traced the entire path of the Peterson override from his inbox to legal's rejection queue to his final impatient signature. That overlooked clause glowed like a beacon in the fine print. The one rule he had ignored because he assumed no one would dig that deep. The rule that said any bypassed. High-risk approval without board notification rendered the entire decision chain void and shifted liability squarely back to the signing manager, him. I allowed myself the smallest, quietest smile as I pictured the moment he would realize the investigation he launched to destroy me was actually built on his own careless signature staring back at him from every page. Then my phone buzzed softly on the desk with a short, encrypted message from someone in legal. You're aware the board already received an unredacted copy of the full override trail, and my heartbeat skipped because that meant the dominoes were already falling faster than even I had hoped. The lead compliance officer made his first real mistake when he accidentally referenced the wrong email chain number in one of his follow-up questions to me, mentioning a thread that actually contained Thomas's angry insistence that the risk flags be ignored because I said so. And although I could have pointed it out immediately, I chose to say nothing, letting that single careless reference sit there like a lit fuse because it exposed the entire pattern of mismanagement Thomas had created over months. My continued silence became my strongest weapon, forcing them to keep talking, keep explaining, keep slipping, while I mentally mapped every error for later use. Thomas strode past my door again, smirking openly now and calling out in a loud, arrogant tone. All documents need to be forwarded to compliance by noon. No exceptions, believing he was tightening the noose around my neck, when in reality every word he spoke was another knot tightening around his own. I watched the clench of his jaw, the tiny twitch in his left hand, the overconfidence radiating from him like heat, and I knew that arrogance is almost always the first crack that brings powerful people down. Later, an email pinged quietly from IT support. We detected untracked edits in the core Peterson contract file metadata. Do you want a full forensic copy of the audit trail? And I replied with one word, yes, then sat back as another piece clicked into place. I visualized the entire situation like a spiderweb with Thomas at the center, every thread he had pulled leading back to him. The memos he sent pressuring vendors, the overrides he forced through, the complaints he filed anonymously using language copied straight from his own override note, and I whispered to myself under my breath, timing is everything, because one misplaced step now would collapse the whole structure. Then one of the compliance officers stepped away briefly and left his tablet unlocked on a nearby table, the screen glowing with open files that confirmed they were not following half the required protocols. Chain of evidence gaps, missing approvals, rushed timelines, and I memorized the screen in seconds before he returned. I made my first real countermove by calmly requesting a temporary halt to the physical audit, so I could review all relevant procedural documentation under Company Policy Section 7.4. And when they balked, Thomas's eyes widened in genuine surprise, because no one had expected me to speak so evenly or quote chapter and verse from the handbook, plus the exact statute governing internal investigations. I kept my tone neutral, almost bored, but every word was deliberate, a chess move designed to force them onto the defensive, and Thomas muttered under his breath about escalating this to the CEO immediately, as though that threat still carried weight. A trusted colleague discreetly forwarded me an internal memo marked Thomas Caldwell, eyes only, that showed he had misfiled the original risk oversight report months ago. creating the very gap he now blamed on me. And soon after, a vendor from the Peterson deal emailed privately confirming that Thomas had personally called him and pressured him to skip mandatory reporting to keep the timeline. With every detail time-stamped and undeniable, I forwarded each item straight to my mirrored, encrypted archive without altering a single byte. Then Thomas appeared at my office window, staring in with what he thought was menace, completely unaware that the evidence against him was stacking higher every minute. I continued working in deliberate silence while compliance officers chatted among themselves, oblivious that I was quietly building a complete, airtight dossier of their violations and his misconduct. Thomas sent me an instant message that read, "All your documents belong to the company now. Hope you're ready for what comes next." But his usual bravado had started to crack. An HR manager I trusted slipped me a small folded note that read, "I've noticed serious irregularities in how this audit is being run. Proceed carefully." And when she walked away, she glanced toward Thomas's office with a look that said the wind had shifted. Finally, I located the exact clause Thomas had overlooked 3 months earlier, the one requiring board notification for any override of flagged risks. And I knew it was game over because he had never bothered to read the fine print. When he called the compliance lead over and insisted they push forward immediately despite my procedural objections, I felt the quiet certainty settle in my chest, because that demand triggered the clause's protection for me and exposure for him. Soon compliance began. Reading my archived emails aloud in front of witnesses, Thomas nodding smugly beside them, until they reached one missing chain I had intentionally left unindexed in the main system. When it finally surfaced, it showed his direct order overriding my risk rejection in his own words, and I heard his sharp intake of breath as the officer scrolled further. A compliance officer accidentally mentioned a secondary confidential complaint that named Thomas explicitly, something he never intended me to see, and I quietly continued downloading the full unalterable audit trail, knowing the board would see his name long before mine. He tried shouting orders to focus only on her files now, but every command violated internal standards, and I sat there smiling faintly, letting my calmness rattle him more than any argument could. I refused to answer anything beyond basic procedural requests, forcing them to keep digging and making more mistakes while Thomas paced like a trapped animal. He accidentally mentioned an internal strategy meeting to the wrong officer within my earshot, and I noted it silently. I consolidated every piece of evidence, emails, timestamps, memos, vendor statements, procedural violations, into one encrypted master folder. An IT alert flagged anomalies in Thomas's own email signatures used after the complaint date, proving conflict of interest. His instant messages grew frantic and demanding as his arrogance crumbled and compliance officers began exchanging uncertain glances. A colleague almost hinted aloud that I had been collecting evidence, but I smiled and smoothly changed the subject before Thomas could overhear correctly. He misinterpreted the fragment and assumed I was the one panicking. Compliance finally escalated their draft report to HR, and every single misstep Thomas made was now documented in black and white. He tried intercepting emails, but arrived too late. The board called a surprise meeting specifically for him, not me, and when they reviewed the full audit trail, his override stood out in stark relief, while my name never appeared as the party responsible for any breach. His face drained of color as irrefutable timestamps, emails, and clauses lined up against him like soldiers. HR delivered a formal written reprimand to Thomas that afternoon. Compliance quietly admitted multiple procedural errors in how they had conducted the raid. My department and I were officially cleared of wrongdoing. Thomas stood frozen in shock, his arrogance and one careless oversight having engineered his own public downfall. I walked back into my restored office where everything had been carefully replaced, awards rehung, files returned, desk neat again, and sat down in my chair as compliance and HR left without fanfare. I sipped coffee slowly, completely unflustered, knowing the one overlooked clause. My patient observation and disciplined silence had turned the entire attack back on its sender. Thomas could no longer undermine or threaten me. I felt no need to gloat because real power is quiet, precise, and clean. A new email arrived from the board chairman himself. Outstanding work maintaining integrity on the Peterson contract under difficult circumstances. Well done. And I closed the message with a small nod to myself. Victory was mine, quiet, thorough, and completely undeniable.